The presidency of Richard Nixon remains a controversial time in political history. Perhaps the best-known aspect of his term in office was the way it ended, with scandal and resignment in the face of impeachment. Nixon was a divisive figure, even during his time. But before his presidency ended in disgrace, how did he actually perform in the role? Arguably, his greatest success was in foreign policy. So stay tuned as we take a closer look at the presidency and international strategies of Richard Nixon. Nixon's first run at the presidency came in 1960 when he lost out to John F. Kennedy. The presidential contest had been so close that many questioned the legitimacy of the election, citing irregularities in both Illinois and Texas. Republicans even urged Nixon to contest the results. Still, Nixon remained diplomatic, stating, "I could think of no worse example for the nations abroad, who for the first time were trying to put free electoral procedures into effect, than that of the United States wrangling over results of our presidential election, and even suggesting that the presidency itself could be stolen by thievery at the ballot box." His dignified and pragmatic acceptance of defeat earned him praise from both his critics and supporters. He ran again in 1968, during which time the Republicans were actively pursuing a Southern strategy that sought to attract and increase votes from white Southerners while disenfranchising black voters. At the same time, Nixon tried to appeal to more moderate and liberal voters by claiming he had a secret plan to end the increasingly controversial Vietnam War. Despite his non-confrontational approach, Nixon's anti-communist reputation was enough to convince the more conservative voters that he would not give up the fight against communism. His opponent, Hubert H. Humphrey, was vice president to Lyndon B. Johnson, whose unpopular Vietnam policies cost Humphrey the presidency. Although Johnson did put a stop to the bombing of North Vietnam, it was less than a week before the election, which was too late for Humphrey to gain any real ground on Nixon's lead. Nixon soon implemented several important domestic reforms in areas such as welfare policy, law enforcement, civil rights, and the environment. However, Nixon felt there was a greater need to focus on the country's foreign affairs. The Cold War was ongoing, and America refused to recognize the People's Republic of China. The Vietnam War was exacerbating both situations and was growing increasingly unpopular in the eyes of the American public. Despite decades of fighting communism internationally, America had failed to eradicate this perceived threat to democracy. The Nixon administration was increasingly of the opinion that they would have to recognize the communist republics and would need to find a way to retreat from these conflicts without it looking like an American defeat. Through strategic diplomacy, Nixon aimed to withdraw from Vietnam, seek to end the threat of hostilities in Russia, and re-establish relations with mainland China. Nixon sought to move away from the pay any price, bear any burden mentality of his predecessors, and in his inaugural address, promised an era of negotiation. Yet, Nixon did not want to end the strategy of containing communism. Instead, he hoped to replace confrontation with diplomacy, intending to moderate the Soviets rather than antagonize them. Also, as Russia's relationship with China had deteriorated, Nixon reasoned that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. He hoped that through negotiations, he could play these communist powers against each other and use both to strengthen his position in Vietnam. Nixon saw negotiations with Russia and China as a way to end the Vietnam War. He hoped that by having both of these communist superpowers on his side, the Vietnamese would concede to a peace agreement that would be acceptable to the U.S. He stated, "Though rapprochement with China and détente with the Soviet Union were ends in themselves, I also consider them possible means to hasten the end of the war. At worst, Hanoi was bound to feel less confident if Washington was dealing with Moscow and Beijing. At best, if the two major communist powers decided that they had bigger fish to fry, Hanoi would be pressured into negotiating a settlement we could accept." Nixon took office in January 1969 and began implementing his international strategies almost immediately, starting with talks with Russia. In November of that year, Nixon entered into discussions with the Soviets with the intention of restraining the ongoing arms race in intercontinental ballistic missiles that carried nuclear weapons. The strategic arms limitation talks with Russia began on November 17, 1969, and negotiations took place in Helsinki, Finland. Alongside diplomacy with Russia, Nixon began to tackle the Vietnam issue with a two-pronged approach. He increased the U.S. military presence in the country and ordered secret air raids on the North Vietnamese base camps in Cambodia. Nixon wanted North Vietnam to know he was willing to escalate hostilities. He also hoped that due to the negotiations with Russia, the Soviets would pressure the North Vietnamese into engaging in peace talks. Although Nixon was confident that his strategies would give him the edge in negotiations, he soon realized it was bringing him no closer to ending the war. On June 8, 1969, Nixon met with the president of South Vietnam, Nguyen Van Thieu. They conducted a private meeting on Midway Island and discussed various aspects of the ongoing conflict, as well as the possibility of a U.S. withdrawal. Later that month, Nixon announced the withdrawal of 25,000 U.S. troops from Vietnam. Nixon and his advisors began to develop a new strategy called Vietnamization that Nixon announced to the American public on November 3, 1969. The plan was to implement a gradual and phased withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam, while training and equipping the South Vietnamese forces to take on their own military defense. In his speech, Nixon declared, "In the previous administration, we Americanized the war in Vietnam. In this administration, we are Vietnamizing the search for peace." However, Nixon did not end the secret war in the neutral country of Cambodia. Although he would later insist that this campaign was necessary while his Vietnamization strategy took hold, he would come under harsh criticism when the operation was finally revealed. Throughout the 1970s, the Nixon administration continued to engage in diplomatic talks with the Soviet Union and tentatively began paving the way for political relations with China. Nixon publicly acknowledged the communist state by referring to it as the People's Republic of China, something that the U.S. had previously refused to do. He also took steps toward Vietnamization, although the withdrawal of troops caused serious morale and drug problems amongst the soldiers still stationed in the country. The idea that they would have to defend themselves also did not sit well with the South Vietnamese, who felt that the withdrawal of the better trained and better equipped American forces would leave them practically defenseless. Opportunities to begin communication with China were not forthcoming. Still, in a strange turn of events, in 1971, the U.S. table tennis team paved the way for diplomatic talks. Due to a mix-up at the 1971 World Table Tennis Championship in Japan, American player Glenn Cowan ended up on the Chinese team's bus. Cowan was photographed with the Chinese champion Zhao Zedong, and the U.S. team subsequently received an invitation to tour China with the Chinese team. Although the U.S. players were legally restricted from traveling to or in communist-controlled portions of countries listed in their passports, Japanese authorities simply crossed out China. The trip was dubbed Ping Pong Diplomacy, and after this cultural exchange and demonstration of goodwill, Nixon lifted the trade embargo on China and, on July 15th, announced live on television that he would visit the People's Republic of China the following year. He stated, "I have taken this action because of my profound conviction that all nations will gain from reducing tensions and a better relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China." On February 21, 1972, Nixon was photographed shaking hands with Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai. Nixon's trip to China was highly orchestrated, down to the red coat that the First Lady, Pat Nixon, was wearing when they arrived. TV cameras broadcast the visit worldwide, and Nixon hoped that this highly publicized trip would aid his ongoing negotiations with Russia. His plan came to fruition when in May 1972, Nixon arrived in Moscow, where both he and Leonid Brezhnev signed the SALT I agreement on May 26th. Some of the most important aspects of this agreement were the Treaty of Anti-Ballistic Missile Systems and the Interim Agreement and Protocol on Limitations of Strategic Offensive Weapons. The ABM Treaty limited how much of the country could be defended by anti-ballistic missiles, and therefore left both countries vulnerable to attack, which was used as a strategic deterrent for open warfare. The interim agreement saw both sides agree to freeze their numbers of intercontinental ballistic missiles for 5 years, as the superpowers entered into a second round of negotiations. Although 1972 could arguably be seen as the high point of Nixon's presidency, it wasn't all success. Nixon's administration had become embroiled in the Watergate scandal that would later cost him the presidency, and he still had not been able to end America's involvement in the Vietnam War. In October, Nixon's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, successfully brokered a peace agreement with North Vietnam. However, Win Van Theo, fearing that the U.S. was going to abandon him, refused to sign, causing the North Vietnamese to pull out, and the negotiations collapsed. Nixon, frustrated and probably feeling the pressure from the ongoing Watergate investigation, instigated extreme measures to finalize the Vietnam situation. In January 1973, at the Paris Peace Accords, Kissinger pressured the North Vietnamese into signing the peace agreement, while Nixon threatened massive airstrikes and ordered bombing raids on North Vietnam until the treaty was signed. Nixon then told Win Van Theo that he had to make peace, regardless of whether he agreed, and South Vietnam was also forced to sign the accord. A ceasefire was agreed upon, and on January 27th, Nixon abolished the draft. By the end of March 1973, the last U.S. combat troops had left Vietnam. Nixon's strategies were remarkable in that they shifted the U.S. foreign policy away from the struggle for power between the U.S. and the Soviet Union to focus more on diplomacy and trade relations. Nixon came to power after a difficult decade in American politics. By focusing on international rather than domestic issues, he was able to assert America as a coherent global power, and through negotiations, resolved issues that were detrimental to the country's transnational standing. In whatever light Nixon is viewed in the aftermath of the Watergate scandal, his legacy is undeniable. The diplomatic relationships he forged with the Soviet Union and China set America on the path to end the Cold War. His doctrine of supporting allies with weapons and training rather than ground troops paved the way to the Reagan and Weinberger doctrines of only sending in U.S. armed forces as a last resort. Although, ultimately, it could be said that Nixon only ever acted in his best interests, doing whatever would bring him the most accolades, it does not negate the fact that he did, as promised, usher in an era of negotiation. How would you like to get a deeper understanding of history, impress your friends, and predict the future more accurately based on past events? If this sounds like something you might be into, then check out the brand new Captivating History Book Club by clicking the first link in the description. To learn more about history, check out our Captivating History book series. It's available as ebooks, paperbacks, and audiobooks. Also, grab your free mythology bundle ebook while it's still available. All links are in the description. If you found the video captivating, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.